Picture a man who changed how millions think about happiness, yet his own story was buried under centuries of slander. Epicurus didn't just develop a philosophy, he built a commune that scandalized ancient Athens, wrote over 300 scrolls, and died in agony while claiming to be perfectly happy. Here's what actually happened. The year is 341 BC. On the Aegean island of Samos, a boy is born to parents who occupy the lowest rungs of Athenian society. His father, Neocles, is a schoolteacher scraping by on minimal fees. His mother, Chaerestrata, goes door to door performing purification rituals, essentially working as a religious charlatan for desperate housewives. They're Athenian colonists, which means they're citizens of the most powerful city-state in Greece, but they're living in exile on a dusty island nobody cares about. This is not the origin story of a man who should matter. The boy's name is Epicurus, and nothing about his childhood suggests greatness. He grows up watching his mother recite magical formulas to cleanse homes of evil spirits. His father teaches basic literacy to children whose parents can barely afford to feed them. The family's poor, powerless, and stuck on an island that exists mainly to remind Athens where it sends people it doesn't want. But something happens when Epicurus turns 14. His schooling begins in earnest, and he encounters a teacher named Pamphilus. This man introduces him to the writings of Democritus, a philosopher who died decades before Epicurus was born. Democritus had proposed something radical. Everything in the universe, absolutely everything, is made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. These atoms move through empty space, colliding and combining to form every object, every sensation, every thought you've ever had. Most people dismissed this as absurd speculation. Epicurus became obsessed. If everything is atoms, he reasoned, then there's no divine intervention controlling our fates, no gods manipulating human affairs like puppets on strings, just matter following natural laws. The implications were staggering, and the teenage Epicurus couldn't let them go. At 18, he leaves Samos for Athens to complete his mandatory military service. He arrives in 323 BC, the same year Alexander the Great dies in Babylon. The timing matters. Alexander's death throws the Greek world into chaos. His empire fractures immediately. Generals fight over the pieces, cities revolt, the old certainties crumble, and young Epicurus, stationed in Athens as a military recruit, watches the philosophical schools compete for attention in this suddenly unstable world. The Academy, founded by Plato, still teaches that true reality exists in some other realm of perfect forms. The Lyceum, run by Aristotle's successors, focuses on categorizing and studying the natural world. The Stoics, a brand new school, argue that virtue alone brings happiness and that everything happening is part of divine providence. Each school promises answers. Each claims to show the path to the good life. Epicurus finds them all unsatisfying. The Platonists are lost in abstractions that have nothing to do with how people actually live. The Aristotelians are brilliant at analysis, but offer no practical guidance for someone struggling with fear or pain. The Stoics tell you to accept your fate, which sounds noble until you realize they're asking you to be grateful for disasters. Something else bothers him. Every school is led by men from wealthy, established families. They teach in expensive facilities. They charge high fees. Philosophy has become a luxury good, accessible only to those who can afford years of leisurely study. But the questions philosophy addresses, questions about death, suffering, desire, fear, these aren't luxury problems. They're human problems. A dock worker worries about death just as much as an aristocrat, probably more. His military service ends. Instead of returning to Samos, Epicurus begins a decade of wandering. He travels to Colophon, where he studies with a philosopher named Nausiphanes, who's also fascinated by Democritus. He moves to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos and tries to establish a school. It fails. He's run out of town, possibly because his ideas about the gods are too radical even for a backwater island. He relocates to Lampsacus on the Hellespont and tries again. This time something clicks. He's 32 years old, and he finally begins to attract students. Not wealthy aristocrats looking for intellectual polish, but ordinary people, tradesmen and freedmen who respond to his central message. You don't need to be afraid. Not of death, not of the gods, not of fate. The universe operates according to natural laws, and once you understand those laws, the fears that poison human life simply evaporate. He teaches that death is nothing to fear, because death is simply the end of sensation. When you exist, death doesn't. When death exists, you don't. You'll never experience being dead, so why waste your living moments dreading it? The gods exist, he claims, but they're not watching you. They're perfectly happy beings living in the spaces between worlds, completely indifferent to human affairs. They didn't create the universe, they don't answer prayers, and they certainly don't punish people in an afterlife. This is borderline heresy, but he states it calmly, as simple facts derived from atomist physics. If everything is atoms and void, there's no room for divine intervention. The gods are just another type of atomic structure, no more capable of violating natural law than humans are. His following grows. People start calling themselves Epicureans. After 4 years in Lampsacus, he makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. He's going back to Athens, and this time he's going to do philosophy differently. In 307 BC, Epicurus purchases a house with a large garden on the outskirts of Athens. He's 35 years old. The property isn't in the fashionable part of the city. It's outside the walls, away from the commercial centre, far from the fancy colonnades where the other schools operate. This is deliberate. He's not competing with the academy or the lyceum. He's building something else entirely. He calls it the garden. Not a school, not an academy, but a garden, and he opens it to everyone. Women can attend, which is shocking. Slaves can attend, which is unthinkable. You don't need money, connections, or even literacy. The garden operates on one principle: friendship. Members live together, eat together, study together. They support each other financially and emotionally. It's part philosophy school, part mutual aid society, part intentional community. The curriculum is simple. Epicurus has distilled his philosophy into 4 core principles, later called the tetrapharmakos, the 4-part cure. Don't fear God. Don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. Everything else is commentary. Every discussion, every text, every lesson circles back to these 4 insights and their implications. But it's the lifestyle that really scandalizes Athens. Garden members don't pursue wealth or political power. They live simply, eating mainly bread, water, and vegetables. Once, Epicurus writes to a friend, asking him to send some cheese so they can have a feast. Cheese counts as luxury. They avoid marriage and childbearing, not because these things are evil, but because they create complications and anxieties that interfere with tranquility. They withdraw from public life entirely, rejecting the traditional Greek assumption that a good man must participate in politics. This withdrawal infuriates Epicurus's critics. The Greeks have a phrase, idiots, which means a private person, someone who doesn't engage in public affairs. It's where we get idiot. To respectable Athenians, the Epicureans are idiots by choice, selfish pleasure seekers who've abandoned their civic duty to hide in a garden and pursue their own comfort. The accusation sticks because Epicurus does talk about pleasure constantly. He argues that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, the only thing worth pursuing for its own sake. Everything else, virtue, knowledge, friendship, is valuable only because it produces pleasure or helps you avoid pain. This sounds like hedonism, like he's advocating a life of endless indulgence, but that's not what he means at all. When Epicurus talks about pleasure, he's talking about the absence of pain. Physical health, mental tranquility, freedom from fear and anxiety. The highest pleasure, he insists, is a state he calls ataraxia, a complete calm of mind. You achieve this not by satisfying every desire, but by eliminating unnecessary desires entirely. Most of what we want we don't actually need. Most of what we fear will never happen. Strip away the false beliefs, the groundless anxieties, the socially constructed wants, and what remains is simple, sustainable contentment. He divides desires into 3 categories: natural and necessary desires, food when you're hungry, water when you're thirsty, shelter from the cold. These must be satisfied, but they're easy to satisfy. Natural but unnecessary desires, fancy food, sexual pleasure, variety and experience. These are fine in moderation, but pursuing them intensely creates more trouble than satisfaction. Unnatural and unnecessary desires, wealth, fame, power, luxury. These are completely artificial, created by society, and they can never be satisfied. The more you get, the more you want. They're traps. Live simply, he teaches. Surround yourself with friends. Study philosophy, not as abstract theory, but as medicine for the soul. Face your fears directly by understanding their irrationality. And above all, withdraw from the competition and chaos of public life into a community of like-minded people who support each other in living well. The garden becomes famous, or perhaps infamous. Stories circulate around Athens. Some are true, most are exaggerated, many are complete fabrications. Yes, women and slaves participate as equals, which is genuinely revolutionary. Yes, members live together in what looks to outsiders like suspicious intimacy. Yes, they reject traditional religion and politics, but the rumours go further. They're having orgies in there. They're worshipping Epicurus as a god. They're corrupting the youth, just like Socrates supposedly did. None of it is true. The garden is actually remarkably chaste by Greek standards. Epicurus teaches that sexual pleasure is natural but unnecessary, and usually causes more trouble than it's worth. He's not worshipped, he's just the founder and teacher. As for corrupting youth, the average Epicurean is probably less corrupt than the average Athenian politician, but that's not saying much. The slander doesn't stop the garden from growing. People keep coming. Some stay for a few months, absorb the teachings, and return to their normal lives with a new perspective. Others commit completely, living in the garden permanently. A core group of devoted students forms around Epicurus. Metrodorus becomes his closest friend and most important collaborator. Hermarchus, Polyaenus, and Colotes contribute to developing and defending the philosophy. These aren't just students, they're partners in a shared project. Epicurus writes constantly, letters to friends and followers, treatises on physics and ethics, detailed responses to critics. His major work, On Nature, eventually stretches to 37 books. 37. He's addressing every possible objection, working out every implication of atomism, building a complete system that explains everything from the movement of the stars to the nature of justice. Most of this writing is lost now. We'll get to why later, but at the time, Epicurus is producing one of the most comprehensive philosophical systems in the ancient world, rivaling Plato and Aristotle in scope, if not in style. His prose is notoriously difficult, dense and technical. He's not trying to produce literary masterpieces. He's trying to be precise, to leave no room for misinterpretation. The garden operates for decades. Epicurus teaches, writes, and lives according to his principles. He never marries. He owns almost nothing. He eats simply. He avoids politics completely. By his own standards, he's successful. He's created a community of friends, living tranquil lives, free from the fears and desires that torment most people. He's developed a philosophy that actually helps people cope with existence, not just in theory, but in practice. But the body that houses all this thought is failing. Somewhere around his 60th year, Epicurus begins experiencing severe health problems. The details are unclear, but he's in constant pain. Some ancient sources suggest kidney stones, others mention urinary blockages. Whatever the specific condition, it's agonizing and progressive. He's dying slowly, and he knows it. This is the test. Everything he's taught about pain, about death, about maintaining tranquility in the face of suffering, now he has to live it. His critics are watching, waiting to see if his philosophy can withstand reality. If he breaks, if he despairs, if he cries out against the gods or curses his fate, everything he's built collapses. He doesn't break. In his final days, Epicurus writes a letter to his friend Idomeneus. The letter survives. It's one of the most remarkable documents in ancient philosophy, not because of what it argues, but because of what it proves. I write this to you on a happy day, which is also the last day of my life. Strangry and dysentery have attacked me, which could not increase in their intensity. But against all these pains is ranged the joy in my heart at the memory of our past conversations. Read that again. He's dying in agony, multiple organ systems are failing. The pain is so severe he describes it as unable to increase. And he's happy, not resigned, not stoic, happy. He continues, "Take care of the children of Metrodorus in a manner worthy of the devotion shown by the young man to me and to philosophy." His last thoughts aren't about his own suffering. They're about making sure his dead friend's children are cared for, about the community continuing, about protecting what matters. Then he dies. The year is approximately 270 BC. He's around 70 years old. He's lived through wars, political upheaval, the collapse of Alexander's empire. He's built something that will outlast all of it, though he couldn't have known how long or how strange its journey would be. The garden continues without him. Hermarchus takes over leadership. The community maintains its practices, its study, its way of life. But something fundamental has shifted. The living presence of the founder is gone. What remains is the teaching, and the teaching spreads. This is the part that surprises people who only know Epicureanism through later distortions. Within a century of Epicurus's death, Epicurean communities exist throughout the Greek world. Athens, obviously, but also Antioch, Rhodes, Lampsacus. Wherever Greek culture extends, the philosophy follows. It spreads to Rome, where it finds particularly fertile ground among certain intellectuals who are tired of the rigid Stoicism that dominates Roman philosophical life. The transmission happens through texts and teachers. Students who studied at the garden return home and establish their own communities. They copy Epicurus's writings and distribute them. They write their own treatises defending and explaining the philosophy. A whole literature develops. Most of it disappears. We need to pause here and understand what's lost. Epicurus wrote 37 books of On Nature alone. Gone. All gone except for fragments. He wrote letters, treatises on specific topics, works on ethics and physics and theology, almost all destroyed. Of the 300 scrolls attributed to him in antiquity, we have 3 short letters and a collection of maxims. That's it. Why? Multiple reasons, none of them encouraging about human civilization. First, ancient texts required constant copying to survive. Papyrus deteriorates, parchment degrades. Every generation had to decide what was worth preserving. Epicureanism was controversial. When Christianity became the dominant force in Mediterranean culture, Epicurean atomism, with its denial of divine providence and its materialism, became heresy. Copying stopped, the texts vanished. Second, even before Christianity, Epicureanism had powerful enemies. The Stoics, who dominated Roman philosophy, saw Epicureanism as fundamentally wrong about everything. Pleasure as the good, atoms instead of divine providence, withdrawal from politics. Each point contradicted Stoic teaching. They wrote against it relentlessly. Third, the slander that started in Epicurus's lifetime never stopped. Later writers, Christian and pagan alike, used Epicurean as shorthand for hedonist, atheist, coward. The actual philosophy was buried under layers of misrepresentation. But before all that, before the loss and distortion, there's a golden period, roughly 300 BC to 100 BC, 2 centuries when Epicureanism is one of the major philosophical schools, competing with Stoicism, Platonism, and Aristotelianism for influence. During this period, something unexpected happens. The philosophy attracts followers who are nothing like the stereotype. Take Lucretius. He's a Roman, writing around 50 BC. We know almost nothing about his life. Even his full name is uncertain. But he writes a poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, that preserves Epicurean physics in stunning detail. It's 6 books of Latin hexameter verse explaining atoms, void, the soul, sensation, cosmology, human civilization, and the nature of the gods. It's also one of the greatest poems in Latin literature. This matters. Lucretius isn't writing a dry philosophical treatise. He's creating art. He describes the movement of atoms with the same intensity that Homer describes battles. He makes physics beautiful. The opening invokes Venus, which seems strange for an Epicurean work. Venus represents the creative principle, the force that drives atoms to combine and form new things. Lucretius isn't worshipping her. He's using her as a poetic device. But the poetry itself is worship of a kind, worship of nature, of reality, of the cosmos in all its mechanical, meaningless, accidental glory. When first the light of spring is revealed, and the generative breeze of the west wind blows strong, first the birds of the air herald you, goddess, and your coming, struck to the heart by your power. This is an atheist philosophy being presented through religious imagery. Lucretius understands something crucial. You can reject supernatural explanations while still feeling awe. The universe doesn't need gods to be magnificent. Book 3 of the poem addresses the fear of death directly. Lucretius uses every argument Epicurus developed, but he adds something. Rhetoric, passion. He's not just explaining why death isn't bad, he's trying to make you feel it. Death, therefore, is nothing to us, nor does it concern us a scrap, seeing that the nature of the mind is mortal. And just as we felt no distress in time past when the Carthaginians came from all sides to the conflict, so when we shall be no more, when the parting shall have come about between body and spirit from which we are compacted into one whole, then sure enough nothing at all will be able to happen to us, who will then be no more, nor will anything rouse our feeling. You didn't exist for billions of years before you were born. Was that bad? No. You didn't experience it. Death is the same. You won't be there to experience it. The only suffering is the anticipation, the fear. Remove the fear, remove the suffering. The poem appears at a crucial moment in Roman history. The Republic is collapsing. Caesar is campaigning in Gaul. Civil war is approaching. Into this chaos, Lucretius offers a philosophy of withdrawal, of finding peace by understanding nature and limiting desire. It doesn't stop the collapse. Philosophy rarely does, but it preserves something. When the poem is rediscovered in 1417, during the Renaissance, it triggers a revolution in European thought. Atomism returns. Materialism becomes intellectually respectable again. Scientists start thinking about matter and motion in ways that lead eventually to modern physics. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to the ancient world. Epicureanism spreads through the Roman elite in the 1st century BC. Prominent figures become followers. Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins, is an Epicurean, which is ironic since Epicureans are supposed to avoid politics. But Cassius apparently decides that tyranny is a form of pain that must be removed from the world, even at the cost of political involvement. The philosophy also attracts quieter followers. People who genuinely do withdraw from public life, who live simply, who cultivate friendships and study nature. They're not famous, they don't leave records, but they exist, scattered throughout the Roman world, practicing what Epicurus taught. And then there's Herculaneum. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts. Everyone knows about Pompeii, the city buried in ash. Fewer people know about Herculaneum, buried in something worse. Pyroclastic flows of superheated gas and volcanic material that carbonized everything, organic instantly, including scrolls. The Villa of the Papyri, a luxurious Roman villa in Herculaneum, contains a library. When excavations begin in the 18th century, workers find carbonized scrolls, hundreds of them. They look like charcoal logs, touch them wrong, and they crumble to dust. But they're readable, barely. With the right techniques, the text can be recovered. And what's in them? Epicurean philosophy, works by Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean philosopher who lived in the 1st century BC, fragments of other Epicurean texts. Possibly, though this is still being determined, works by Epicurus himself. These scrolls represent the single largest discovery of Epicurean texts since antiquity. They're still being read. New techniques using particle accelerators and AI are revealing text that was invisible before. The process is agonizingly slow, but it's happening. What they contain matters less than what they prove. In 79 AD, nearly 300 years after Epicurus' death, wealthy Romans are still reading Epicurean philosophy. They're building entire libraries devoted to it. They're commissioning copies of texts. They're keeping the tradition alive. But they're also changing it. Roman Epicureanism isn't quite the same as Greek Epicureanism. The Romans are more pragmatic, less interested in detailed physics, more focused on ethics and practical wisdom. They adapt the philosophy to their own needs. This is how traditions survive. They bend, they accommodate, they evolve. Rigid orthodoxy dies, flexible interpretation persists. Meanwhile, the slander continues. Cicero, the great Roman orator and Stoic sympathizer, attacks Epicureanism repeatedly. He misrepresents it systematically, turning it into a caricature. Pleasure-seeking pigs, he calls them. Philosophical cowards who hide from civic duty. He's not entirely wrong about the withdrawal from politics. Epicureans do avoid it, but he misses the point. They're not cowards, they're making a choice. Politics is painful, corrupting, and ultimately futile. Better to cultivate your garden. The phrase cultivate your garden doesn't come from Epicurus. It comes from Voltaire 2,000 years later, but it captures the Epicurean attitude perfectly. Focus on what you can control. Improve your small corner of the world. Let the empires rise and fall. Christianity changes everything. This isn't about theology or metaphysics. It's about cultural dominance. When Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, alternative philosophies become suspect. Epicureanism is particularly vulnerable. Its atomism denies divine creation. Its ethics reject divine reward and punishment. Its theology, which acknowledges gods but denies they care about humans, is functionally atheistic. Its physics contradicts Genesis. Its ethics contradict Christian morality. The texts stop being copied. The schools close. The communities dissolve. By 500 AD, Epicureanism is effectively extinct in the Mediterranean world. What survives, survives by accident. Lucretius' poem survives because it's great poetry, and scribes copied it for literary rather than philosophical reasons. The letters of Epicurus survive because they were quoted in other works. Fragments survive because they were used as examples in grammar texts, or preserved in later philosophical works attacking Epicureanism. The rest vanishes. 300 scrolls become 3 letters. 37 books become scattered quotations. An entire philosophical tradition becomes a historical footnote. For 1,000 years, from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, Epicureanism is dead. Medieval Europe knows almost nothing about it except the name, which becomes synonymous with gluttony and vice. Dante puts Epicurus in the sixth circle of hell, with the heretics burning in flaming tombs. The irony would have amused Epicurus. He taught that there's no afterlife, no punishment, no hell. And in the Christian imagination, he's condemned to eternal torture for teaching exactly that. But the garden isn't quite dead. It's dormant, waiting. In 1417, a man named Poggio Bracciolini discovers a manuscript in a monastery. It's a copy of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, forgotten for centuries. He has it copied and distributed. The poem spreads through Renaissance Europe. The impact is seismic. Suddenly, educated Europeans are reading about atoms, about infinite worlds, about pleasure as the good, about gods who don't care about human affairs. They're reading it in beautiful Latin verse that makes it all seem not just plausible, but inspiring. The Renaissance doesn't happen because someone decides it's time for a Renaissance. It happens because people start reading texts that had been locked away, forgotten, ignored. Lucretius is one of those texts. The poem is radical. Not in the modern sense, in the original sense. It goes to the root. It questions everything. Creation, purpose, death, the soul, divine providence, all the comfortable assumptions that medieval Christianity had built its worldview upon. And it does so beautifully. That matters. If Lucretius had written a dry philosophical treatise, it might have been filed away again. But poetry has power. It lodges in the mind. It spreads. People quote it. They argue about it. They can't ignore it. Thomas More reads it. Machiavelli reads it. Montaigne reads it. Shakespeare might have read an English translation. Galileo certainly knows about it. The ideas start circulating again. Atoms, void, motion, randomness, a universe that operates by natural law rather than divine intervention. This is dangerous. The church knows it. Lucretius goes on the index of forbidden books. But the damage is done. You can't unread an idea. You can ban the book, but the arguments remain. They've entered the conversation. They're being debated in universities, in private letters, in coded references that everyone understands. Epicureanism itself doesn't come back, not fully. The garden doesn't reopen, but the ideas mutate. They influence other philosophies, they feed into the scientific revolution. When Galileo argues that the universe operates by mathematical laws independent of divine will, he's closer to Lucretius than to Aristotle. When Newton describes a clockwork cosmos, he's describing something Epicurus would recognize, even if the details differ. The atomism survives, transformed into chemistry and physics. The ethics survive, transformed into utilitarianism and secular humanism. The critique of religion survives, transformed into Enlightenment skepticism. Pierre Gassendi, a French priest and scientist in the 17th century, tries to baptize Epicureanism. He wants the physics without the atheism. He accepts atoms but adds God as the creator who set them in motion. He accepts pleasure as important but subordinates it to Christian virtue. It's an awkward hybrid. Epicurus would have hated it, but it makes the philosophy respectable. It allows educated Christians to engage with atomism without being accused of heresy. Gassendi's version of Epicureanism influences Locke, who influences Jefferson. The chain of influence is real even if it's transformed beyond recognition. Thomas Jefferson is an Epicurean. He says so explicitly in his letters. He calls Epicurus the greatest of ancient philosophers. He compiles his own collection of Epicurus's teachings. He identifies with the ethics, prudence, moderation, friendship, simple pleasures, withdrawal from the chaos of politics, which is ironic because Jefferson was deeply involved in politics his entire life. But he dreamed of retiring to Monticello, to his books and his gardens. He dreamed of ataraxia even if he never achieved it. The pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence is a phrase that echoes Epicurean ethics. Not hedonism, not license, but rational pursuit of genuine well-being. By the 19th century, Epicureanism is respectable again. It's still misunderstood. The word epicure still means someone who enjoys fine food and wine. But philosophers are taking Epicurus seriously. John Stuart Mill reads him. Karl Marx writes his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and Democritus. Friedrich Nietzsche respects him. They don't all agree with him, but they engage with him as a serious thinker, rather than dismissing him as a degenerate. The 20th century brings archaeology. In 1752, workers digging in Herculaneum, a Roman city buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, discovered a villa. It's later identified as the Villa of the Papyri, probably owned by a wealthy Roman Epicurean named Lucius Calpurnius Piso. Inside are hundreds of carbonized scrolls. Most are in terrible condition. They're charred, fragile, impossible to unroll without destroying them. But modern technology is beginning to read them using X-ray imaging and AI. They contain Epicurean texts, mostly works by Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher who lived in the 1st century BC. Nothing by Epicurus himself has been found yet, but hope remains. The villa hasn't been fully excavated. More scrolls might exist. And if they do, if somewhere in those carbonized remains there's a lost work by Epicurus, a complete text rather than scattered fragments, it would transform our understanding of ancient philosophy. Modern physics doesn't vindicate Epicurus. The atoms he described aren't the atoms of quantum mechanics. He was wrong about the details, but he was right about the general principle. Matter is composed of tiny particles in motion. The universe operates by natural law. There's no cosmic purpose, no divine plan, just particles and void and the patterns that emerge from their interactions. That's closer to modern cosmology than anything Plato or Aristotle imagined. They believed in eternal forms and unmoved movers. Epicurus believed in stuff bouncing around. He was guessing. He had no microscopes or particle accelerators, but his guess was better than theirs. The ethics are harder to evaluate. Is pleasure really the good? Modern psychology complicates the question. We know that pleasure and happiness aren't the same. We know that humans are terrible at predicting what will make them happy. We know that adaptation and hedonic treadmills mean that pursuing pleasure directly often fails. Epicurus knew some of this. That's why he distinguished between necessary and unnecessary desires. That's why he emphasized mental pleasures over physical ones. That's why he valued friendship and tranquility over excitement and luxury. He was doing psychology without the scientific method, and he got a lot right. But he got things wrong too. The withdrawal from politics isn't always wise. Sometimes the city needs you. Sometimes injustice demands engagement. Epicurus lived through terrible times, yes, but so did Marcus Aurelius, and he chose duty over tranquility. So did countless others who decided that some things are worth the pain. Epicurus offers one answer to how to live. It's not the only answer, maybe not even the best answer for everyone, but it's a serious answer, a coherent answer, an answer that worked for him and for thousands of his followers. The garden lasted 6 centuries. That's longer than most philosophical schools, longer than most religions, if we're honest. The academy closed, the lyceum closed, the stoa eventually faded, but the garden kept going, kept teaching the same core doctrines, kept practicing the same way of life. That suggests something. Not that it's true necessarily, but that it's viable, that people can actually live this way and find it fulfilling. What would Epicurus make of the modern world? He'd hate most of it. The noise, the crowds, the constant stimulation, the advertising designed to create unnecessary desires, the political chaos, the information overload, the anxiety machines we carry in our pockets. He'd see it all as precisely what he warned against. We've built a civilization that makes tranquility nearly impossible. We're surrounded by sources of disturbance. We've multiplied our desires far beyond what's necessary. We've created new forms of pain and called them progress. But he might see opportunities too. We're richer than anyone in his era could imagine. Most of us have enough to eat. We're not constantly threatened by war or plague or famine. We have medical care. We have leisure. We have books and music and friends. The natural and necessary desires can be satisfied easily. The problem is that we don't stop there. We want more. We always want more, and we suffer because of it. The Epicurean solution is simple. Stop wanting more. Learn to be satisfied with enough. Cultivate simple pleasures. Spend time with friends. Think clearly about death and realize it's nothing to fear. Avoid politics and ambition and all the things that disturb your peace. It sounds easy. It's not. It never was. Even in the garden, surrounded by like-minded people, dedicated to the philosophy, practicing it daily, tranquility was difficult. Epicurus himself suffered from illness. He experienced pain. He had to work at maintaining his ataraxia. It wasn't automatic. In our world, it's harder. The garden was a retreat, a refuge, a place set apart from the city. We don't have that. We live in the city. We're bombarded by messages telling us to want things, to achieve things, to compete, to worry, to care about things that don't matter. Opting out is difficult when the whole culture is designed to pull you in. But people try. There's a modern Epicurean movement, small, mostly online. People who've read the texts and decided to apply the philosophy to contemporary life. They're trying to figure out what it means to live Epicurean in the 21st century. How do you practice friendship in an age of social media? How do you limit desires in a consumer economy? How do you avoid politics when politics affects everything? They don't have perfect answers. Epicurus didn't have perfect answers either. But they're asking the questions, they're making the attempt. The irony is that our misunderstanding of Epicureanism might be useful. When people hear Epicurean, they think gourmet food and fine wine. That's wrong, but it's not entirely wrong. Epicurus did value pleasure. He did think enjoying a good meal with friends was important. He just thought simple meals were usually better than fancy ones. If the modern epicure focuses on quality over quantity, on savouring rather than gorging, on the pleasure of company rather than the status of the restaurant, they're closer to Epicurus than they realise. The problem is when it becomes about luxury, about impressing others, about feeding unnecessary desires. That's the opposite of what Epicurus taught. The scandal of Epicureanism is that it doesn't demand much. It doesn't ask you to be a hero. It doesn't require self-sacrifice or noble suffering. It doesn't promise transcendence or enlightenment. It just says, be happy, take care of yourself, enjoy simple pleasures, be kind to your friends. Don't worry about things you can't control. It's almost embarrassingly modest. Philosophy is supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to require discipline and struggle and the subjugation of base instincts to higher purposes. Epicureanism says no. Your instincts are fine. Pleasure is fine. Just be smart about it. That modesty is why it survived. People could actually do it. You didn't need to be a saint. You didn't need extraordinary virtue or superhuman willpower. You just needed to think clearly and choose wisely. The high-minded philosophies that demand perfection tend to produce either hypocrites or failures. Epicureanism set a lower bar, a realistic bar, and people cleared it. The other scandal is the atheism. Epicurus technically wasn't an atheist. He believed gods existed, but his gods don't do anything. They don't create, they don't judge, they don't answer prayers, they don't care. They're off in the spaces between worlds, experiencing perfect pleasure and perfect tranquility, completely indifferent to human affairs. Functionally, This is atheism. If the gods don't matter, it doesn't matter whether they exist. And Epicurus knew it. He kept the gods for cultural reasons, for poetic reasons, maybe even for political reasons. But his philosophy doesn't need them. That's threatening. Most ancient philosophies incorporated the divine somehow. Even skeptics like Pyrrho didn't deny the gods outright. Epicurus came close. Close enough that his enemies could call him an atheist. Close enough that Christian authorities would ban his books. The universe he describes is materialist, mechanistic, and purposeless. Things happen because atoms move. That's it. No cosmic plan, no destiny, no meaning beyond what we create ourselves. It's a stark vision. For some people, it's liberating. For others, it's terrifying. Which brings us back to the central question. Is Epicureanism true? Not in details. We know atoms aren't little solid particles with hooks. We know pleasure and pain are neurochemical processes, not metaphysical principles. But is the core insight true? Is pleasure the good? Is tranquility the goal? Is the examined life, stripped of illusions about death and gods and cosmic purpose, the life worth living? Epicurus would say yes. Obviously, yes, what else could the good be? Pain is bad. Everyone agrees on that. Pleasure is good. Everyone seeks it. Everything else, virtue and honor and justice and knowledge, are good only because they lead to pleasure or prevent pain. They're instrumental goods. Pleasure is the final good, the thing we want for its own sake. But is he right? The question haunted philosophy for 2,000 years. It haunts us still. The challenge to Epicureanism came from an unexpected direction. Not from priests or politicians, but from other philosophers who agreed that happiness mattered, but disagreed about what happiness was. The Stoics were the problem. They emerged around the same time as the Epicureans in the same Hellenistic world, facing the same questions about how to live in uncertain times. But they reached opposite conclusions. Where Epicurus said, pleasure is the good, the Stoics said, virtue is the good. Not virtue as a means to pleasure, virtue as the end itself. They had a thought experiment. Imagine two lives. In the first, you're virtuous but miserable, tortured, enslaved, suffering constant pain. In the second, you're vicious but happy, wealthy, comfortable, experiencing constant pleasure, but gained through cruelty and injustice. Which life is better? Epicurus would have to say the second. If pleasure is the good and pain is the bad, then the happy villain wins, the virtuous sufferer loses. That's just logic. The Stoics found this conclusion repulsive. They said the virtuous sufferer lives better. Obviously, because virtue is what makes a life good, not pleasure. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was a direct attack on Epicurean ethics, and it worked. The Stoic position felt more noble, more aligned with what people wanted to believe about themselves. Nobody wants to admit they'd choose pleasure over virtue. Nobody wants to be the person who says, yes, I'd rather be a happy monster than a suffering saint, even if it's true, even if that's what we'd actually choose. We don't want to say it out loud. The Stoics gave people permission to value what they already wanted to value. Honor, duty, courage, justice, not as tools for achieving pleasure, but as goods in themselves. Epicureanism started losing ground. Not immediately, not everywhere, but gradually the Stoic message spread. It appealed to soldiers, to politicians, to anyone whose life required sacrifice. You can't tell a soldier that pleasure is the highest good and expect him to charge into battle. But you can tell him that virtue is the highest good, that dying nobly is better than living shamefully, that some things matter more than survival or comfort. The Stoics offered meaning, purpose, a framework for making sense of suffering. Epicureanism offered relief, tranquility, an escape from anxiety and fear. In times of peace, Epicureanism thrived. In times of war, Stoicism dominated. This created a problem for Epicurean communities. The garden worked when the world was relatively stable, when you could retreat into private life and cultivate friendships and simple pleasures. But when Rome started conquering everything, when civil wars erupted, when political life became dangerous and unavoidable, the Epicurean strategy looks like cowardice. Live quietly. Don't get involved. Pursue pleasure. Avoid pain. That's fine advice for peaceful times. It's terrible advice for revolution, and the late Roman Republic was revolutionary. The old order was collapsing. Power was up for grabs. Men like Julius Caesar and Pompey were reshaping the world through violence and ambition. What was an Epicurean supposed to do? Stay in the garden and tend vegetables while Rome burned? Some did exactly that. They followed the founders' teaching. They withdrew. They cultivated their friendships and their tranquility and let the ambitious destroy each other. Others couldn't. The pull of politics was too strong. The stakes too high. They got involved despite their philosophy telling them not to. The most famous case was Cassius. Gaius Cassius Longinus was one of the assassins who killed Julius Caesar. He was also an Epicurean. This created a problem for later historians. How does an Epicurean justify political assassination? Epicurus said avoid politics, seek tranquility, don't take unnecessary risks. Cassius did the opposite. He risked everything to kill the most powerful man in Rome. Why? The standard Epicurean answer would be fear. Caesar threatened the Republic. The Republic's collapse would mean civil war, instability, danger. Better to kill one man than endure years of chaos. That works as logic, but it's not very satisfying. It makes Cassius sound like a coward protecting himself rather than a hero defending liberty. The Stoics had a better story. Brutus, the other famous assassin, was a Stoic. For him, killing Caesar was about virtue, about duty, about choosing honor over safety. That's the kind of story people remember. That's the kind of story that inspires. Epicureanism couldn't compete on those terms. It offered the wrong kind of satisfaction. Pleasure instead of glory, tranquility instead of meaning, private happiness instead of public virtue. As Rome transitioned from a republic to empire, Epicureanism faded from the center of intellectual life. It didn't disappear. There were still Epicurean communities, still teachers passing on the doctrines, but the momentum shifted. Stoicism became the philosophy of emperors. Marcus Aurelius writing his Meditations, Seneca advising Nero, Epictetus teaching slaves and freedmen how to endure suffering with dignity. Epicureanism retreated to the margins, to small communities of friends who still believed that pleasure and tranquility were worth more than glory and honor. Then Christianity arrived, and everything changed. The early Christians had complicated feelings about Epicureanism. On one hand, the materialism was obviously heretical. No immortal soul, no divine providence, no cosmic justice. That couldn't be tolerated. On the other hand, the lifestyle had some appeal: simple living, community of friends, rejection of wealth and status. Those were Christian virtues too. But the philosophical foundation was incompatible. Christianity needed the soul, needed divine judgment, needed the promise of eternal reward and the threat of eternal punishment. Epicureanism denied all of that. Death is the end. The gods don't care. There's no cosmic justice. Make the best of this life, because it's the only one you get. That couldn't stand, not in a Christian world. The Church Fathers attacked Epicureanism viciously. They called Epicureans atheists, hedonists, degenerates. They burned the books they could find. They suppressed the teachings. By the early Middle Ages, Epicureanism had effectively disappeared from Europe. A few fragments survived, scattered references in other texts, but the main works were lost. The philosophy that had once dominated the ancient world vanished for 1,000 years, until 1417. That year a book hunter named Poggio Bracciolini discovered a manuscript in a German monastery. It was a copy of Lucretius's poem, The Nature of Things, the greatest exposition of Epicurean philosophy in existence. Poggio probably didn't realize what he'd found. Just another old text to copy and preserve. But that manuscript changed everything, because Lucretius was brilliant. His poem made Epicureanism vivid, compelling, almost irresistible. It described a universe of atoms and void, a world operating by natural laws without divine intervention, a vision of death as peaceful oblivion rather than terrifying judgment. The manuscript circulated among Italian humanists. They copied it, studied it, debated it. Some were scandalized, others were liberated. By the time the Renaissance was in full swing, Epicurean ideas were everywhere. Not always acknowledged, not always attributed, but present. The atomism influenced early modern science. The materialism shaped Enlightenment philosophy. The ethics inspired countless thinkers who wanted to ground morality in human nature rather than divine command. Thomas Hobbes read Lucretius and developed a political philosophy based on fear of death and desire for security. Pierre Gassendi tried to reconcile Epicurean atomism with Christian theology. Thomas Jefferson kept a portrait of Epicurus and called himself an Epicurean. The ideas that Christian authorities had tried to bury came roaring back. Not in pure form, nobody was founding new gardens or reciting the principal doctrines, but the core insights survived. Pleasure matters, pain matters, death is nothing to fear. The gods, if they exist, don't care about us. We're on our own, make the best of it. That's essentially the modern secular worldview. We don't call it Epicureanism anymore. We don't trace it back to an ancient Greek philosopher most people have never heard of. But the DNA is there. Every time someone says there's no afterlife, so make this life count. Every time someone rejects religious authority in favour of personal happiness, every time someone chooses comfort over duty, pleasure over honour, tranquility over glory. That's Epicurus winning, 2,000 years late, through intermediaries who didn't always credit him, but winning nonetheless. The question is whether we should celebrate that victory or mourn it. Because there's a dark side to Epicureanism that its defenders don't like to acknowledge. The withdrawal from public life, the rejection of political engagement, the focus on private pleasure over collective good. That works fine when you're privileged, when you have the luxury of retreating into a garden with your friends, when the world's problems don't force themselves on you. But what about people who can't retreat, who don't have gardens, who face injustice they can't ignore? Epicurus says, avoid politics, don't get involved, protect your tranquility. But that's a privilege. It assumes you have the option to withdraw. Most people don't. Most people are stuck in the world. They can't opt out. They have to engage with power and politics and all the messy, complicated struggles that Epicurus told his followers to avoid. And when the privileged withdraw, when the educated and capable people decide politics is too unpleasant and retreat into private life, who's left to run things? The ambitious, the power-hungry, the people who want control more than they want tranquility. That's not a recipe for a good society. That's a recipe for tyranny. The Stoics understood this. They said, you have a duty to engage, to contribute, to use your abilities for the common good, even when it's difficult or painful. That's less pleasant than Epicureanism. It asks more of people, but it might be necessary. It might be what holds civilization together. So maybe Epicurus was wrong, not about pleasure and pain, those are real, but about what we should do with that knowledge. Maybe the insight that pleasure is good and pain is bad should lead us toward engagement rather than withdrawal, toward trying to reduce suffering in the world rather than just protecting ourselves from it. Or maybe that's asking too much. Maybe Epicurus was right that most people aren't going to be heroes, aren't going to sacrifice themselves for abstract principles, aren't going to choose duty over happiness. Maybe the realistic goal is just helping people live better lives. Less anxious lives, less painful lives. And if that means some withdrawal from the chaos of politics, maybe that's acceptable. These questions don't have obvious answers. They're the same questions every generation faces. How much do we owe to others? How much should we sacrifice our own happiness for the collective good? When is withdrawal legitimate, and when is it cowardice? Epicurus offered one answer, clear, consistent, focused entirely on the individual's well-being. His philosophy was for people who wanted to be happy, not people who wanted to be heroes. Whether that makes him wise or selfish depends on what you think life is for. Epicurus built his philosophy on pleasure. But what did he actually mean by that word? Because here's where it gets interesting. When most people hear pleasure, they think of what makes them feel good in the moment. Food, sex, entertainment, luxury, the immediate gratification stuff. Epicurus didn't mean that at all. He divided pleasures into categories. The first kind he called kinetic pleasures. These are the active ones. The sensation of eating when you're hungry, drinking when you're thirsty, sex, movement, stimulation. These feel good while they're happening, but they're temporary. They fade. They require constant renewal, and chasing them creates a cycle. You satisfy one desire, and immediately another appears. You're never done, never satisfied, never at peace. The second kind he called static pleasures. And this is what he actually cared about. Static pleasure isn't a sensation. It's a state, the absence of pain, the absence of disturbance. You're not hungry, not thirsty, not anxious, not afraid. You're just okay, content, tranquil. That doesn't sound exciting. It doesn't sound like what people mean when they say they want pleasure. But Epicurus argued it's the only pleasure that lasts. The only one that doesn't create new problems. The only one compatible with genuine happiness. His word for this state was ataraxia, untroubledness, an almost medical term for what we might call peace of mind. This was the goal. Not ecstasy, not intensity, not peak experiences, just the sustained absence of disturbance. The problem is that nobody seeks that naturally. We're wired to chase kinetic pleasures. The hits, the highs, the moments of intensity. Evolution made us that way because ancestors who aggressively pursued food and sex passed on their genes. Ancestors who sat around feeling content didn't. So our default programming pushes us toward exactly the kind of pleasures Epicurus said to avoid. His philosophy was trying to reprogram that instinct, to convince people that what they naturally want isn't actually what will make them happy. That's a hard sell. It requires people to distrust their own desires, to accept that their intuitions about pleasure are wrong, to believe a philosopher who says the path to happiness involves wanting less rather than getting more. And Epicurus had rules, specific guidelines about which desires to pursue and which to eliminate. He categorized them into 3 types: natural and necessary desires. These are the ones you must satisfy. Hunger, thirst, shelter, basic physical needs. Ignore these and you'll be miserable. No amount of philosophy can make starvation pleasant. So take care of them. But here's the key. Take care of them simply. Eat cheap food, drink water, live in modest housing. Don't upgrade your needs beyond the minimum, because the moment you start requiring fancy meals or luxury accommodations, you've created new vulnerabilities. Now you need money, status, access. You've made yourself dependent on things outside your control. Natural but unnecessary desires. These are the upgrades. Gourmet food instead of simple meals. Sex beyond what's needed for reproduction. Comfortable furniture. Entertainment. These aren't required for survival, but they're natural extensions of basic needs. Epicurus said you can indulge these sometimes, carefully, with awareness that you're creating risks, because every pleasure you grow accustomed to becomes something you'll miss when it's gone. Every taste you develop becomes a potential source of suffering. Vain desires, these are the completely artificial ones. Wealth beyond what you need. Fame, power, luxury goods, status symbols, the things people pursue because society tells them these are valuable. Epicurus said, eliminate these entirely. They're not just unnecessary, they're actively harmful, because they can never be satisfied. There's always someone richer, always someone more famous, always a more expensive luxury item. The pursuit is endless, and it makes you dependent on external validation, on what other people think, on circumstances you can't control. This is why his community lives simply, not from religious asceticism, not from moral righteousness, from strategic self-interest. They calculated that simple living was the path to maximum pleasure, not because deprivation feels good, because it protects you from suffering. Think about it this way. Someone who needs $1 million to feel secure will suffer whenever their wealth is threatened. Someone who can be content with bread and water is nearly invulnerable. They've eliminated most of their pressure points, most of the ways the world can hurt them. That's the logic. Minimize your needs and you minimize your suffering, which sounds great in theory. In practice, it means giving up most of what makes life feel rich. No ambition, no striving, no pursuit of excellence in anything that requires resources, no engagement with the full spectrum of human experience. You gain invulnerability by shrinking your life, by making yourself small and simple and unambitious. Is that wisdom or cowardice? Epicurus would say it's neither. It's just calculation, a rational assessment of what actually produces well-being. But there's something unsettling about it, something that feels like giving up, like the philosophy of someone who's been hurt too many times and decided the solution is to stop trying, stop wanting, stop caring about anything that might disappoint you. His followers took this seriously. They lived in the garden. That's what they called their community, not a school, not an academy, a garden, a place of deliberate simplicity. They grew their own food, ate together, studied philosophy, avoided entanglements with the outside world. Men and women together, which was radical for Athens, slaves and free people, a community of equals, at least in theory, all pursuing the same goal, tranquility through simplicity, but maintaining that required constant discipline, constant monitoring of desires, constant checking whether you were developing attachments that would make you vulnerable. It was almost monastic, almost religious in its demands. For a philosophy that claimed to be about pleasure, it sure involved a lot of restriction, a lot of saying no, a lot of careful management of natural impulses. Epicurus himself apparently practiced what he preached. The historical sources say he lived on bread and water most days. Cheese was a luxury. He had chronic health problems, kidney stones that caused intense pain, but he maintained his tranquility even through that, found pleasure even in suffering by focusing on past good memories and philosophical conversation with friends. There's something admirable about that, something almost heroic in the refusal to be defeated by circumstances. But there's also something sad, a philosopher of pleasure who lived in pain, a theorist of enjoyment who denied himself most enjoyments, a teacher of happiness who never seemed particularly happy. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe he was happy. Maybe the internal state he achieved really was better than what most people experience. We can't know. We can't feel what he felt, but from the outside, it looks like sacrifice, like someone who convinced himself that less is more because he couldn't have more. The thing is, his approach might actually work for some people, people whose temperament naturally inclines towards simplicity, who don't need much stimulation, who find complexity exhausting rather than enriching. For them, Epicureanism could be liberation, permission to opt out of the rat race, to stop chasing things they never really wanted anyway. But for people who thrive on challenge, Who need projects and goals and something to strive toward? Epicureanism is a prison. It tells you that everything you naturally want is a trap, that ambition is suffering, that the solution to life's problems is to stop trying to solve them and just accept a minimal existence. That might reduce suffering, but it also reduces life, makes it smaller, less vibrant, less interesting. And maybe that's the fundamental trade-off. You can have security or you can have richness. You can have tranquility or you can have intensity. You can be safe or you can be alive. Pick one. Epicurus picked safety. He built a philosophy for people who were tired of being hurt, tired of disappointment, tired of the chaos of human ambition and desire. He offered them peace, but peace came with a price. The price was almost everything else. The question is whether that's a price worth paying, whether a life of perfect tranquility is better than a life of meaningful struggle, whether avoiding suffering is more important than pursuing excellence. Different people will answer differently, but it's worth noticing that most of the people we remember, most of the people who achieved great things, most of the people who made lasting contributions did not choose Epicurus's path. They chose the messy, painful, ambitious route. They accepted suffering as the cost of attempting something significant. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they'd have been happier in a garden growing vegetables and talking philosophy with friends. Maybe they wasted their lives chasing illusions, or maybe Epicurus was wrong. Maybe there are things worth suffering for, goals worth pursuing, even knowing you'll face pain, achievements that justify the struggle required to reach them. That's not a question philosophy can answer. It's a question each person has to answer for themselves, based on their own temperament, their own values, their own sense of what makes life meaningful. But here's what's interesting. Epicurus thought he was being scientific, objective. He thought he'd discovered a universal truth about human happiness, that pleasure is good, pain is bad, therefore minimize pain and you maximize good. Mathematical, logical, unassailable, except it's not. Because humans aren't simple. We don't just want to feel good, we want meaning, purpose, achievement, connection, things that often require pain, sometimes lots of it. And when we get those things, even through suffering, we report being happy, satisfied, fulfilled. Not tranquil, not at peace, but alive in a way that Epicurean contentment never captures. So maybe the flaw in Epicurus's system is right at the foundation. The assumption that pleasure and pain are the only things that matter, that all goods reduce to feeling good and all bads reduce to feeling bad. That's intuitive, but it might be wrong. There might be goods that aren't pleasures, values that matter independent of how they make us feel. And if that's true, then the whole structure collapses. The careful categorization of desires, the strategic withdrawal from complexity, the pursuit of ataraxia above all else. It all rests on a premise that seems obvious but might be false. This is where Epicureanism connects to modern life in uncomfortable ways. Because contemporary consumer culture is basically Epicureanism without the discipline. We believe pleasure is the goal. We pursue it constantly. But we chase kinetic pleasures rather than static ones. We want the hits, the stimulation, the peak experiences. We don't want tranquility, we want intensity. So we end up with Epicurus's starting premise, but none of his wisdom about how to pursue it. We've taken his materialism, his focus on pleasure, his rejection of transcendent meaning, and married it to our evolutionary drive for more, better, faster, stronger. The result is a society of people chasing pleasures that never satisfy, accumulating possessions that never bring peace, pursuing experiences that leave them wanting the next one. Epicurus predicted exactly this problem. He warned against it. He built an entire system to avoid it, but nobody listened to the solution. Everyone just accepted the premise and ignored the logic that followed, because the solution is hard. It requires giving things up, saying no to natural desires, living more simply than you could afford to live. And in a culture that measures success by consumption, that's not just hard, it's almost impossible. You can't be an Epicurean and also participate fully in modern society. The demands are incompatible. Society says, want more. Epicurus says, want less. Society says, pursue status. Epicurus says, ignore status. Society says, maximize your income. Epicurus says, minimize your needs. You have to choose. And most people choose society because the alternative feels like losing, like giving up, like admitting defeat, even when intellectually they know that the rat race makes them miserable, even when they understand that their desires are manufactured by advertising and social pressure, even when they recognize that they're sacrificing their well-being for goals they don't actually care about. They still can't stop, because stopping would mean acknowledging that everyone else is wrong, that the entire structure of modern life is built on false premises, that happiness requires rejecting almost everything society tells you to pursue. That's too big a leap, too radical a break, so people stay on the treadmill, exhausted, anxious, perpetually unsatisfied, living exactly the kind of life Epicurus spent his career warning against. The paradox deepens when you look at what actually happens in the garden. Because while Epicurus preached withdrawal from society, his community became one of the most intense social experiments in ancient Athens. These weren't hermits living in isolation. They were people who'd chosen to structure their entire lives around friendship, around shared meals and conversation and mutual support. That requires enormous social skill. It demands constant negotiation of boundaries and needs. It creates dependencies that are exactly the kind of complication Epicurus claimed to be avoiding. And here's what's fascinating. The garden worked. For decades, people joined, stayed, built lives there. They reported being happy. The community survived Epicurus's death and continued for centuries. So clearly something about the model was sustainable. But was it the philosophy that made it work? Or was it the fact that they had something else? A sense of belonging, shared purpose, the feeling that they were part of something meaningful, things that have nothing to do with pleasure calculation and everything to do with human connection. Modern intentional communities face the same tension. Whether it's communes in the 60s, co-housing movements today, or digital nomad collectives, the pattern repeats. People gather around an idea about how to live better. They create structures to support that lifestyle. And then the social dynamics become more important than the founding principles. The community works because people care about each other, not because they're following the right philosophical system. Epicurus would probably say that's fine, that friendship is part of the plan, that the community structure is just a practical application of his principles. But there's a difference between friendship as instrumental good and friendship as intrinsic good. Between valuing people because they contribute to your tranquility and valuing them for their own sake. The first is compatible with Epicurean philosophy. The second isn't. Because if you value people intrinsically, then their suffering matters even when it doesn't affect you. Their flourishing is good even when it costs you peace of mind. You can't both deeply love someone and remain perfectly tranquil while they struggle. The two goals conflict, so either friendship is shallow enough to preserve ataraxia, or ataraxia isn't actually the highest good. Epicurus faced this problem directly. He was famous for his friendships. His letters show genuine affection, real concern, deep investment in other people's well-being. He didn't write like someone optimizing for personal tranquility. He wrote like someone who cared. But that creates an internal contradiction, one his followers had to navigate every day. The question isn't whether you can care about people while pursuing ataraxia. Clearly, you can care to some degree. The question is whether you can care enough, whether the kind of relationships that actually sustain human beings are compatible with a philosophy that makes your own peace of mind the ultimate goal. And the answer seems to be no. Not fully. You have to compromise somewhere. Either you compromise the philosophy, allowing that some disturbances are worth it, some pains are acceptable costs of deeper goods, or you compromise the relationships, keeping enough distance to preserve your equilibrium. Most people in the garden probably did both. They bent the philosophy to fit their human needs while maintaining enough of the structure to feel they were still Epicureans, which brings us to the fundamental problem with any philosophy that claims to have the answer. Life is complicated. Human beings are complicated. Any system simple enough to remember and follow is too simple to capture everything that matters. And any system complex enough to be complete is too complex to actually live by. Epicurus tried to thread this needle. He offered principles simple enough to memorize. The fourfold remedy, the categorization of desires, the focus on ataraxia. But he lived a life complex enough to be fully human. The friendships, the community, the ongoing engagement with ideas and people and situations that didn't fit neatly into categories. The result is a philosophy that works on paper but gets messy in practice. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to find a system you can follow perfectly. Maybe the point is to have a framework that helps you think clearly about what matters. That gives you language to identify patterns you're stuck in. That offers alternative perspectives when your default approach isn't working. From that angle, Epicureanism is incredibly useful, not as dogma, but as tool. When you notice yourself chasing things that don't actually make you happy, Epicurus's categories help you see what's happening. When you're overwhelmed by anxiety about the future, his arguments about death and providence offer perspective. When you're caught in the status game, his emphasis on simple pleasures provides an exit. You don't have to accept the whole package. You don't have to agree that pleasure is the only good or that ataraxia is the highest aim. You can take what's useful and leave the rest, which is probably what most people who engage with philosophy actually do anyway. They borrow tools, they test ideas, they keep what works and discard what doesn't. But there's a cost to that approach, because philosophical systems aren't meant to be buffets where you pick and choose. They're meant to be coherent wholes where each part supports the others. When you extract one piece, you lose the context that makes it work. The idea that disconnects from its foundations might not function the way it did in the original system. Take Epicurus's advice to avoid politics. In the context of his full philosophy, with its emphasis on friendship and community and simple living, that makes sense. You're building an alternative to political life, a space where different values govern. But extract just that one piece, the don't get involved in politics part, and suddenly it becomes something else, an excuse for apathy, a justification for privilege, a way to ignore injustice because engagement would be disturbing. Same advice, different meaning, because meaning depends on context. And context is the whole system of thought that generated the advice in the first place. This is the problem with self-help culture's relationship to philosophy. It wants the actionable insights without the metaphysical commitments. It wants the life hacks without the worldview. But the hacks don't work without the worldview. Or they work differently. Or they produce effects the original system was designed to prevent. Epicurus becomes treat yourself. Stoicism becomes suppress your emotions. Buddhism becomes mindfulness apps. Each tradition gets reduced to a technique stripped of the understanding that made the technique meaningful. And people wonder why the techniques don't deliver what was promised. Because what was promised was transformation, complete reorientation of how you relate to existence. And what's being offered is tips, strategies for feeling slightly better, while changing nothing fundamental about how you live. That's not necessarily wrong. Feeling slightly better is good, and most people aren't looking for complete transformation. They're looking for relief, for ways to cope with the life they have, rather than alternatives to that life, which is reasonable, practical, maybe even wise given the constraints most people face. But it's not what Epicurus was offering. He was offering a different life, one that required giving things up, that demanded structural changes, that only worked if you went all in. You can't be half Epicurean any more than you can be half pregnant. Either you've reorganized your existence around the pursuit of ataraxia, or you haven't. There's no middle ground, except there is. Because humans are excellent at middle grounds, at taking what works and ignoring what doesn't, at holding contradictory ideas simultaneously, at living inconsistently and being basically fine with it. We're not logical systems. We're messy, adaptive, contradictory creatures who muddle through. So maybe the real lesson isn't that Epicurus got it right or wrong. Maybe it's that any philosophy claiming to explain everything is going to fail somewhere. That the gaps and contradictions aren't bugs, they're features. They're where life is actually happening, in the space between what the system says and what experience demands. Epicurus experienced this himself. His letters show a man navigating complications his philosophy didn't quite account for, dealing with pain that wasn't supposed to matter, caring about outcomes he claimed not to care about, living a richer, messier life than his categories allowed. And that's the version of Epicurus that's actually useful. Not the systematic philosopher with all the answers, the human being trying to figure out how to live well, while dealing with the same contradictions we all face. The teacher who offered tools knowing they wouldn't solve everything. The friend who built a community because he understood that some goods can't be pursued alone. That Epicurus has something to teach us. Not how to achieve perfect tranquility. That's probably impossible and might not even be desirable. But how to think more clearly about what we're pursuing and why. How to notice when we're chasing satisfactions that don't satisfy. How to create spaces where different values can govern. How to build communities that support lives we actually want to live. The philosophy works best when you stop trying to follow it perfectly and start using it as a lens. A way to examine your own patterns and assumptions. A set of questions rather than a set of answers. What are you afraid of? What are you chasing? What would be enough? These aren't questions with final answers. They're questions you have to keep asking, because the answer changes. What you need at 20 isn't what you need at 40. What satisfies you in one context leaves you empty in another. The desires you've satisfied generate new desires. The fears you've conquered are replaced by different fears. Life keeps moving. Any static system, no matter how well designed, eventually gets overtaken by change. Which means the question isn't whether Epicurus got it right. It's whether his way of thinking helps you navigate your particular moment with your particular challenges. And for some people, in some situations, it does. The emphasis on examining desires, the distinction between necessary and unnecessary wants. The reminder that many fears are baseless. The permission to pursue simple pleasures. These insights land. For others, different philosophies resonate. Stoicism's focus on what you can control. Buddhism's attention to suffering and its causes. Aristotle's emphasis on virtue and flourishing. Christianity's promise of meaning through relationship with the divine. Each tradition offers tools. Each has strengths and limitations. Each works for some people and not others. The trap is thinking any one of them is the answer, that if you just find the right system and follow it faithfully enough, you'll figure out how to live. But life doesn't work that way. You don't solve it. You don't arrive at a final configuration where everything makes sense and nothing hurts, and you're done. You just keep going, keep adjusting, keep learning what works and what doesn't in this particular stretch of the journey. Epicurus understood that, even if his system sometimes suggests otherwise. He kept teaching until he died, kept writing letters, kept refining his ideas, kept engaging with new questions and old problems that wouldn't stay solved. The garden wasn't a place where people achieved ataraxia and then coasted. It was a place where they kept working at it, together, day after day, Because that's what living well actually requires. Not perfection, not final answers, just ongoing attention to what matters and genuine effort to align your life with your values as best you can. Which is harder than following rules, but more honest than pretending you figured it out. And in the end, maybe that's the most useful thing Epicurus offers. Not a solution, but company. The example of someone else who wrestled with these questions seriously, who tried to build a life around clear principles, who succeeded in some ways and failed in others, who left behind ideas worth engaging with even when you disagree. That's not nothing. In a world that rarely encourages deep thinking about how to live, any tradition that takes the question seriously is valuable, even when its answers are incomplete, even when its methods don't transfer cleanly to modern life, even when you ultimately decide it's not for you. The question is whether engaging with it makes you think more clearly about your own life. And sometimes the answer is yes, not because you adopt the system wholesale, not because you move to a commune or renounce modern comforts or start calculating pleasure units, but because reading Epicurus forces you to ask what you're actually pursuing and why. It makes you notice patterns you'd otherwise ignore. The way advertising creates desires you didn't have. The way social pressure shapes your goals. The way anxiety about the future steals attention from the present. These observations aren't exclusive to Epicureanism, but Epicurus articulated them clearly 23 centuries ago. That clarity is useful, even if you disagree with his conclusions, even if you decide that ambition is worth its costs, or that some fears are rational, or that simple pleasures aren't enough. At least you've thought about it. At least you're choosing consciously, rather than drifting through default settings someone else programmed into you. That's valuable, regardless of which philosophy you ultimately prefer. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not these specific doctrines, though some remain relevant. Not the garden, though its model influenced countless communities. But the basic insistence that questions about how to live deserve serious attention. That you can examine your assumptions. That philosophy isn't just abstract theorizing, but practical investigation into what makes life better or worse. This idea seems obvious now, at least in principle, but it wasn't always. Before the Hellenistic schools, philosophy had been primarily about understanding the cosmos, about metaphysics and epistemology and logic. The Socratics had shifted attention to ethics, but it was Epicurus and his contemporaries who made philosophy explicitly therapeutic, who treated it as medicine for the soul, who insisted that the point wasn't just to understand the world, but to live better in it. That framing stuck. You can trace a line from the garden through Roman Stoicism, through medieval monasticism, through Enlightenment, thought through modern psychology. Different traditions, different methods, but the same underlying question. How should we live? What gets in the way? How do we fix it? Epicurus didn't invent that question, but he made it central in a way that shaped everything after, and he did it without appeals to divine authority, without complex metaphysical systems, without promises of cosmic justice or afterlife rewards. Just observation, reason, and the conviction that humans can figure out how to live well by paying attention to what actually works. That's a radical position even now. Most approaches to the good life involve something beyond human reason. Faith in a deity who defines meaning. Trust in a tradition that provides answers. Hope for transcendence that justifies suffering. Epicurus rejected all of it, not from hostility, but from careful conclusion that none of it was necessary, that you could build a satisfying life from material you already had. Your capacity for pleasure, your ability to reason, your need for friendship, your fear of death that dissolves under examination. That's it. That's enough. You don't need more. Whether he was right is debatable. Whether his approach worked for him is clear. He lived according to his principles for decades. He maintained friendships until the end. He faced death without apparent terror. He wrote from his deathbed about the pleasure of philosophical conversation outweighing his physical pain. That's not proof of anything beyond one person's experience, but it's not nothing either. It demonstrates that his method at minimum worked for its creator, and it worked well enough that others wanted to learn it. Well enough that his school survived him by centuries. Well enough that his ideas kept circulating even when they were officially suppressed. Well enough that we're still talking about them now. That durability suggests something resonant, even if it's not universal truth. Something that keeps speaking to people across vastly different contexts. And when you look at what that something is, it's usually not the atomic theory or the pleasure calculus. It's simpler observations that feel true regardless of philosophical system. That much of what we chase doesn't satisfy. That anxiety often makes things worse. That friendship matters more than most things we prioritize. That simple pleasures are underrated. That death is frightening, partly because we think about it wrong. These aren't revolutionary insights, but they're easily forgotten. Modern life is designed to make you forget them, to keep you anxious and wanting and busy and isolated. Not through conspiracy, but through systems optimized for different goals: economic growth, content engagement, status competition. None of these care whether you're actually happy. They just need you productive and consuming. Epicurus offers a counterweight. Not a complete answer, but a reminder that you can step back, that you can examine what you're doing and ask whether it's making your life better, that you can choose differently. That choice isn't always available. Epicurus himself acknowledged that circumstances constrain options. Poverty, illness, oppression, these create suffering that simple pleasures can't fully address. His philosophy worked best for people with basic security and freedom to make choices. That's a significant limitation. But within that limitation, the insights remain useful. Even people facing genuine hardship report that some Epicurean practices help. Gratitude for small pleasures, focus on what's within control, letting go of unnecessary desires that make situations worse. These aren't solutions to structural problems, but they're not useless either. They're tools. You use them where they apply and look elsewhere when they don't. Which brings us back to the central question. What do we actually take from Epicurus? What survives the translation across 23 centuries, multiple cultural contexts, and radically different material conditions? Not the complete system. That's too bound to its time and place, not the specific community model. We can't recreate the garden even if we wanted to. Not the physics, which modern science superseded. Not the rigid classification of desires, which doesn't map cleanly to contemporary life. What survives is something harder to define. A sensibility, maybe. A way of approaching questions about living that emphasizes clarity over dogma, that trusts observation and reason over tradition and authority. That takes pleasure seriously as a guide rather than something to transcend or deny. That recognizes anxiety as often counterproductive. That values friendship as essential rather than optional. That treats death as a practical problem to solve through better thinking rather than a mystery requiring faith. This sensibility doesn't belong exclusively to Epicureanism. You find versions of it in other traditions, ancient and modern, but Epicurus articulated it with particular clarity and built an entire system around it. That's his contribution. Not final answers, but a coherent framework for thinking about what matters. A framework that some people find useful and others don't. And that's fine. The goal isn't to convert everyone to Epicureanism, it's to add another option to the menu of ways humans have tried to live well. Another set of tools you can borrow from when appropriate. Another voice in the conversation about what makes life good. That conversation needs multiple voices because people are different and situations vary. What helps one person might not help another. What works in one context might fail in another. We need options. Epicurus provides one. a good one, with insights that remain valuable even when you disagree with the overall system. So where does that leave us? With an ancient philosopher who built a school in Athens 23 centuries ago, who taught that pleasure was the highest good but defined pleasure carefully, who promised freedom from anxiety through clear thinking about what matters, who created a community that lasted for centuries and influenced countless others, who wrote extensively, though most of his writing is lost, whose ideas were suppressed, rediscovered, debated, and continue to find new audiences, who remains relevant not because he solved the problem of how to live, but because he asked the right questions, because he refused easy answers, because he insisted that humans could figure this out through reason and observation rather than faith and tradition, because he treated philosophy as practical rather than abstract, because he recognized that the good life requires ongoing attention, not just correct beliefs. That attention is what matters most. Not the specific conclusions Epicurus reached, though some remain valuable, but the commitment to examining your life seriously, to asking what you're pursuing and why, to testing your assumptions against experience, to adjusting course when something isn't working, to building a life intentionally rather than accepting default settings. That's available regardless of which philosophical tradition you prefer. You don't need to be an Epicurean to benefit from Epicurean questions. You don't need to accept his answers to appreciate his methods. You just need to take the underlying project seriously, the project of figuring out how to live well, which is harder than it sounds, easier to ignore, easier to distract yourself, easier to follow scripts someone else wrote, easier to drift through life, reacting to circumstances rather than shaping them deliberately. But you can choose differently. You can stop and think. You can examine what you're doing and ask whether it's moving you toward the life you actually want. You can notice patterns that aren't serving you and try something else. You can build in practices that help and drop practices that don't. This isn't complicated, but it's not easy either. It requires sustained attention, honest self-assessment, and willingness to change when you realize something isn't working. Most people don't do it. They have reasons. It's uncomfortable examining your life closely. It's threatening to question beliefs you've built your identity around. It's exhausting to make conscious choices when you could just follow habits, but the alternative is letting circumstance and conditioning determine everything. Living by default, following paths others laid without asking whether they lead anywhere you want to go. Epicurus rejected that. He insisted you could take control, that you could examine your desires and fears and beliefs, that you could build a life aligned with what actually matters to you rather than what you're told should matter. That's still radical, still countercultural, still worth considering. Not because Epicurus had all the answers, but because he asked questions that remain urgent. What are you actually pursuing? Why? Is it working? What would you change if you examined it honestly? These questions don't have final answers, but they're worth asking repeatedly. Throughout your life, as circumstances change, and you change, and the world changes, because that's what living well requires, not finding the right system and following it forever, but ongoing attention to what matters and genuine effort to align your life with your values. That's the real lesson. Not Epicurus's specific conclusions, but his commitment to the project, his insistence that it's worth doing carefully, his demonstration that you can build a satisfying life through clear thinking about what's actually important. 23 centuries later, that example still speaks. Not to everyone, not in every situation, but to enough people in enough contexts to keep the conversation going. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't to find the philosopher who solved everything, but to engage with traditions that help you think more clearly about your own challenges, to borrow insights where they apply, to learn from both successes and failures, to recognize that every system has limitations while still taking useful tools from each. That's what Epicurus offers. Not salvation, but company. Not certainty, but clarity. Not final answers, but better questions. And for anyone trying to figure out how to live well in a confusing world, that's more valuable than it might seem. Looking back at the garden from this distance, what's striking isn't the philosophy's perfection, it's the audacity of the attempt. A man with no special qualifications, no political power, no inherited authority, decided he'd figured out how to live and convinced others to reorganize their entire existence around his conclusions. That took either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary arrogance, probably both. The garden worked, which is remarkable. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but it functioned as a genuine alternative to the dominant ways of living in ancient Athens. People joined, they stayed, they reported satisfaction. The model persisted for centuries after its founder died. You can't fake that kind of durability. Something real was happening there, even if we struggle to identify exactly what made it work. But here's what nags. The philosophy that emerged from the garden claimed universality. Pleasure is the good. Pain is the bad. Therefore, this is how everyone should live. Except that's not what the evidence suggests. Most people, given the choice, don't choose Epicurean withdrawal. They choose engagement, ambition, complexity, risk. They pursue things that create anxiety and demand sacrifice, and many of them report being satisfied with that choice. Which means either most humans are wrong about what makes them happy, or Epicurus was wrong about what happiness requires. The first option is what Epicurus believed. He thought people were trapped in false beliefs, chasing satisfactions that couldn't satisfy. And maybe he was right about some people, probably right about many people. But all people, that's harder to defend. The alternative is that humans value multiple things. Pleasure matters, but so does meaning. So does achievement. So does contribution. So does connection that goes beyond strategic friendship. These goods sometimes conflict. You can't maximize all of them simultaneously. You have to choose. And different people with different temperaments and circumstances will reasonably choose differently. Epicurus made his choice. He chose tranquility over intensity, security over possibility, withdrawal over engagement. For him, in his context, with his particular nature, that choice worked, but it doesn't follow that the same choice works for everyone. And it especially doesn't follow that people who choose differently are making mistakes. This is the limitation that his system couldn't acknowledge. Because if you admit that some people genuinely flourish through paths Epicurus rejected, then pleasure can't be the only good. There must be other goods, values that matter independent of their contribution to tranquility. And once you admit that, the whole edifice becomes less stable, less universal, more contingent. But maybe that's fine. Maybe the value isn't in the system's universality, but in its specificity. It worked for certain people, in certain situations. It offers tools that remain useful even when you reject the framework. It asks questions worth asking even when you disagree with the answers. That's not nothing. The physics is gone, superseded by better understanding. The theology is irrelevant in a secular age. The community model doesn't transfer to modern contexts, but the ethical core persists. The attention to desire, the examination of fear, the recognition that much suffering is optional, created by wanting what you don't need or dreading what won't happen. These insights survive because they're observably true, at least sometimes, for at least some people. And the method survives. The commitment to examining your life rather than just living it, to questioning assumptions rather than accepting them, to testing beliefs against experience rather than defending them regardless of consequences. That approach transcends any particular conclusion Epicurus reached. It's applicable whether you're pursuing tranquility or achievement, withdrawal or engagement, simplicity or complexity. What's fascinating is how the philosophy keeps finding new audiences. Each generation rediscovers Epicurus and finds something useful, though what they find changes. Renaissance humanists saw liberation from religious authority. Enlightenment thinkers saw the foundation for secular ethics. Modern readers see tools for managing anxiety in an overwhelming world. Same texts, different applications. Because the questions are permanent, even when the answers shift, the slander matters too, not just as historical curiosity, but as demonstration of how ideas get distorted. For 2,000 years, Epicurus was known primarily through misrepresentation, as a hedonist, a glutton, an atheist in the worst sense. The actual philosophy was buried under layers of hostile interpretation, and yet it survived. Fragments preserved by accident, texts copied despite disapproval, ideas that kept circulating even when officially suppressed. That resilience suggests something important, not that the philosophy is correct, but that it addresses real needs. When people are anxious, when they're overwhelmed by desire, when they're paralyzed by fear of death, Epicurus offers practical relief. Not through faith or transcendence or promises of cosmic justice, through clear thinking about what's actually happening and what you can reasonably do about it. That's valuable, regardless of whether pleasure is the highest good. The garden itself is the most interesting legacy, not as blueprint for modern communities, though some have tried, but as demonstration that you can organize life around different values, that the default settings aren't mandatory, that you can examine how everyone else lives, decide it's not working, and build something else. The specifics of what Epicurus built matter less than the fact that he built it, that he proved alternatives are possible. Modern attempts to revive Epicureanism run into predictable problems. The philosophy was designed for a world we don't inhabit. Agricultural economy, slave labor, minimal technology, face-to-face communities. You can't just import the practices into contemporary life and expect them to function the same way. The context has changed too much, but you can adapt the principles. Ask what they were trying to achieve and whether modern methods might serve similar goals better. The focus on simple pleasures translates. The practice of examining desires translates. The attention to what's actually within your control translates. The cultivation of close friendships translates. The reduction of unnecessary anxiety translates. You don't need to accept atomism, or reject politics or live communally. You can take what's useful and leave what isn't, which is probably what most people who engage with Epicurus actually do. But there's always the question of whether that's enough, whether extracting tools from a system while rejecting the system's foundation really works, or whether you lose something essential in translation, whether the insights that seem portable actually depend on commitments you're not making. No clear answer exists. Different people report different experiences. Some find value in selective borrowing, others insist you need the whole package. Both positions have merit. What's certain is that Epicurus won't go away. The questions he asked remain urgent. The problems he addressed persist. The tensions he tried to resolve still tear at people trying to figure out how to live. His specific solutions might not work for you. His system might not compel, but the project itself, the serious examination of what makes life good and how to pursue it intelligently, that's permanent. That's worth engaging with, regardless of which tradition you ultimately find most useful. And maybe that's the real achievement, not the garden that eventually closed, not the books that mostly vanished, not the school that faded away, but the demonstration that these questions deserve sustained attention, that you can approach them systematically. That reason and observation can guide you even when certainty isn't available, that you don't need supernatural assistance to figure out how to live well. You just need to pay attention, think clearly, and adjust course when something isn't working. 23 centuries later, those remain controversial claims. Most traditions still insist you need more: divine revelation, cosmic purpose, transcendent meaning. Epicurus said no. Just pleasure and pain, reason and observation, friendship and clear thinking. That's sufficient. Whether he was right is something each person has to determine for themselves. But the clarity of his position, the coherence of his system, the example of his life, these provide reference points worth considering. Not as final authority, but as one voice in an ongoing conversation about what matters and how to pursue it. The conversation continues because the questions don't get answered permanently. Each generation faces them anew. Each person has to work out their own response. And having multiple traditions to draw from, multiple approaches to consider, multiple examples of how others have grappled with the same challenges, that's valuable. That's how humans learn. Not through revelation, but through accumulation. Building on what came before, testing against experience, keeping what works and discarding what doesn't. Epicurus is part of that accumulation. A significant part, not because he got everything right, but because he got enough right that people keep returning to his ideas 2 millennia after his death. Keep finding something useful. Keep discovering that his questions still cut to the heart of what makes life difficult and what might make it better. That's not a small legacy for a man who never left his city, who owned almost nothing, who built his philosophy on the simplest observations about pleasure and pain, who refused to complicate things unnecessarily, who insisted that the good life was available to anyone willing to examine their assumptions and choose more carefully. Whether that's true remains an open question, but it's a question worth asking, and Epicurus asked it with a clarity that few have matched. That alone justifies the attention his work continues to receive. Not worship, not uncritical acceptance, just serious engagement with ideas that have earned their place in the conversation about how to live. That's what philosophy at its best provides. Not answers that close inquiry, but questions that open it. Not systems that solve everything, but tools that help navigate the parts they address. Not final truth, but useful perspectives that complement others. Epicurus offers that. Take it or leave it, but at least know what you're taking or leaving. At least understand what he actually said rather than what centuries of misrepresentation claimed he said. At least give the ideas a fair hearing before deciding whether they speak to your situation. That's all any philosopher can reasonably ask. And it's all Epicurus needs. His ideas are strong enough to survive honest examination. Whether they survive your particular examination depends on who you are and what you need. But they're worth the test, worth the time to understand properly, worth engaging with seriously, rather than dismissing based on caricature or accepting based on authority. That engagement is what keeps philosophy alive, what makes ancient texts relevant, what allows wisdom from one context to illuminate challenges in another. Epicurus understood that. He built a tradition designed to be tested, questioned, refined. A tradition that welcomed examination rather than demanding faith. That openness is perhaps his greatest contribution. The recognition that truth emerges through inquiry, not decree, through conversation, not monologue, through honest assessment of what works rather than defense of what should work. That approach transcends any particular conclusion. It's method, not doctrine, process, not product. And it remains as relevant now as when Epicurus first walked into his garden and began asking questions that still haven't been fully answered. Nor should they be. The questions are more valuable than any answer could be. They force attention, demand honesty, require thought. And in a world that constantly distracts from what matters, that forces you to pay attention to what matters, that's worth more than certainty ever could be.